Hey there. Welcome to the Efficacious Educator podcast with me, Sarah Bialek. I help middle and high school leaders, especially MTSS leads, assistant principals, and deans who are overwhelmed by reactive behavior systems and want to build clear, coherent systems of support that actually work for students and the adults who serve them. I began my career as a teacher and then a school leader. I cared deeply and I worked hard, but eventually realized something. Effort alone was never going to be enough. What wasn't working wasn't my commitment. It was the system. The structures around us were fragmented and misaligned with how adolescents develop and how leaders are expected to make decisions under pressure. That realization led me to study systems change and spend the last decade coaching schools to redesign discipline, MTSS, and leadership practices to be more human and sustainable. On this podcast, you'll hear real conversations about that work, how leaders move from reactivity to clarity and build systems that support both the students and adults in their care. If you're navigating complex behavior challenges or MTSS decisions and wish you had a thinking partner to slow it all down, you're in the right place. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of the Efficacious Educator Book Club here on the podcast. I am so glad you are joining us. The book club is a new space where every 2 months we'll read a book connected to adolescent development, engagement, and the changing world our young people are growing up in. Each book helps us think more deeply about what adolescents need to thrive and how adults can better support them. For our inaugural conversation, we're diving into the Disengaged Teen by Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop, a book that explores why so many young people are struggling to stay engaged and what parents and educators can do to help them build agency, motivation, and a stronger sense of belonging. Help unpack these ideas and connect them to real practice, I'm joined by incredible educators and leaders. We do have Kyle Conley. Welcome, Kyle. Kyle is the co-founder of Building Leaders. She describes herself as a teacher without a classroom right now. After 2 decades of teaching, coaching, and leading schools, she now uses the lessons she's learned to help others improve equity in teaching and learning. She believes deeply in all children, and unapologetically fights for equitable access to opportunities around the world. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
Next, we have Linda, assistant principal at West Middle School. Linda is a lifelong science educator who spent more than 20 years teaching in both rural and urban communities. For the past 4 years, she's served as a middle school assistant principal in Grand Junction, Colorado, where she's working to build systems that support both students and teachers in the wonderfully complex world of middle school. You brave woman, Linda. I feel incredibly lucky to have the two of you here to help us kick off the book club and to think deeply about how we can better support young people in this moment. Before we begin our discussion, I want to briefly outline the problem the authors describe and the framework they use to help us all understand the experience of our young people. I want to just make sure that folks get a sense of what the problem, the solution, and the framework that the authors offer in this book. So the problem, they say, is that adolescents across the world are losing academic ground, disengaging from learning. Many students report that schoolwork feels irrelevant, too difficult, or too easy. Rates of loneliness and absenteeism are rising, and many young people struggle to find a sense of belonging at school. The chart that you see here comes from the PISA exam, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, a global test given every 3 years to 15-year-olds. Across multiple countries, we're seeing a downward trend in performance and engagement, suggesting something fundamental isn't working for adolescents. The authors argue that parents are a powerful but often overlooked part of the solution. With the right tools and understanding, parents can help young people navigate what they call the 4 modes of engagement: passenger, achiever, resistor, and explorer. These modes help us recognize how a teen is experiencing school in the moment and what kind of support they might need to build self-awareness, agency, and deeper engagement. The book begins by grounding us in a shared definition of engagement, which is this complex interplay of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors that ignite genuine interest in the world. This aligns closely with the research many of us know well, the framework of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral engagement. As you see in this diagram, that you get the sweet spot in the center when students are more likely to experience meaningful, sustained learning. So this model is familiar to me. I wrote about it extensively in the Engage Classrooms book, which is available for free on the Castle website. What I appreciated about the Disengaged Teen in relation to this is the way the authors extend this research by connecting engagement to agency, which is the ability to set meaningful goals and marshal resources to meet them. Agency and engagement come together in this framework that's at the heart of the book, which is called the 4 modes of engagements. This horizontal axis along the bottom represents engagement. So this is what kids feel, think, and do. And from no engagement to high engagement. Then on the vertical axis, this represents agency, what students initiate on their own. So from low agency to high agency. When we place them together, we get 4 modes. The passenger mode in this kind of lower quadrant is low agency and low engagement. Students are present, but they're kind of checked out, going through the motions. So what you might see here is behavioral engagement, but you wouldn't really see deep emotional engagement, like I really care about what I'm doing, or really deep cognitive engagement. The next mode is achiever mode. This is high engagement, but low agency. So these students work hard and follow expectations, but often out of compliance or external motivation. I'm doing it because I've just been given this map and I know what to do. And these kids are cognitively engaged, they're behaviorally engaged. The book talks about emotionally engaged. Sometimes these students are happy achievers, meaning that they are emotionally engaged, and sometimes they are unhappy achievers, meaning that they're not really emotionally engaged and they don't know why they're doing it and they don't have any internal compass. And so they can just be doing the things that they have to do, but they're a little bit anxious about it. The next mode is resistor mode. These students are disengaged in learning, that they have agency, but it's in the opposite direction of their own learning. These students may withdraw or push back, and it's not out of defiance, but out of frustration, overwhelm, or unmet needs. And then lastly, we have explorer mode, which is high agency and high engagement. So students who are in this mode, they're curious, motivated, empowered, and take initiative. I want to say that these are modes. Kids aren't these as identities. It's just a mode that they might move in and out of. You might have explorers in English who will be passengers in math, for example. And they add one layer to this, which is this idea of an agentic engagement. So these students with their agency, you can really see what students do to enrich their own learning. It's about asking questions, proposing ideas, seeking help, and shaping the direction of the task. Together, this framework helps us understand not only where students are, but what kinds of support, relationships, and conditions help them grow toward greater agency and deeper engagement. With that foundation, I'd love to turn to our panelists for some big picture impressions of the book. When you read The Disengaged Teen, what stood out for you? What resonated with your own experience as educators, leaders? Where did you find yourself pushing back or disagreeing? What surprised you? And I'm going to lead with Kyle.
Thanks. I think you did a great job there, Sarah. But I found overall just the giving the framework allowed me to really reflect on a lot of the kids that I know personally and professionally. I really enjoyed the book, and as much as what you just described made it seem very technical, what really resonated with me more so was just the personal connection that I was making and my ability to see like my own biological children, students that I've worked with, my godchildren, husband, my niece, I saw everybody really almost directly called out at some point during the book. And one of the things that I think really all of my teaching and time in classrooms and as a school principal was in Title I schools and students that had come from historically marginalized communities. And I loved the fact that this book reframed how I have heard students who are struggling to fit in or to do school well, if you will. It reframed the narrative of students who are causing problems to really students who are telling us loud and clear as educators, this isn't working for me and I need something different. And so just by like reframing that, I feel like just would have been such a great lens for me to have as a teacher, as a school principal, just really rethinking how I'm perceiving students and what it is that they're trying to tell us. So high level, those were what I took away. I really enjoyed the framework and its ability to really name and identify personal and professional kids.
Yeah. Thank you, Kyle. Linda, what stood out for you, resonated?
Well, when I started reading it, I was really like connecting in so many different ways. And like, I have two boys who are just started high school this year, and I kept thinking of my own children. But then in my interactions with students every single day at school and with families, I do think one of the nice things about the book is when they give you like specific examples of kids. I think it was very much something you could connect to. And I think for how it resonated with me, I will just like reach out that last year we did a book study here on Lost at School with Dr. Russ Green, and he talks a lot about including kids in problem solving, that kids are often, especially kids who are typically resistors or disruptors, that they don't have the skill. Right. And then it's not just a math skill that maybe a kid's lacking. It could be more like a behavioral skill. And that's how they end up sometimes with me down in the office. And so, but really giving kids voice as part of the problem solving is not only teaching them, but is also helping them to feel engaged and have some agency. So there's just a lot of work that we've been doing that I thought, man, this would be a great toolkit for teachers to refer to. I will say that like I don't know if I disagreed, but like the things that I often hear teachers say, or I have said in my own practice, which is like, well, yes, but I've got a room full of 30 kids. I loved when the authors said, can you imagine having a doctor with 30 sick people in the room and trying to solve all their problems simultaneously? And that is often what we are asking of teachers. And so I think there's always the like, yeah, this is great. And this makes sense. But like, what do I do in the practical nature during my 7th period class where all those rowdy guys are? How do I survive this and actually really meet their needs? I loved how they talked a lot about how families, and you said this at the beginning, Sarah, where like families are often overlooked. And I don't know if they're overlooked, but I think sometimes like just so many barriers to communicating and bringing families in. And so you talked about chronic absenteeism. We know this is a nationwide issue. The rates in D51 are concerning at a minimum. And it's not that parents don't care about their kids. I think parents are often sitting there with a kid who's struggling to leave the house and they're not sure, what do I do? The interesting thing for middle school, right, is kids are just testing what it's like to have agency, but often agency feels a little bit like defiance. And so it's misunderstood a lot. And so, like you said, it's a mode. It's not an identity. Like a kid who is maybe in one mode often doesn't mean they are permanently there. And how can we move them from one space to the other? And even how do schools need to look different? Some of the schools that these kids got to go to as part of the solution, I was like, that's awesome, but that doesn't exist where I'm at. There's a lot of alternative high schools. There's not so many alternative middle schools. Like, so I want those experiences for kids as well. Yeah. So I'm happy to have the conversation. I always love to be part of like a problem solving mission, but man, also to just recognize that education is often asked some really tall orders and it's hard to deliver all the time.
Yeah, those are both of what you mentioned really stuck out for me. Kyle, the little vignettes about individual kids throughout the entire book. There's stories, multiple stories, maybe 4 or 5 for each of these different modes that kids are in for different reasons. I really liked the storytelling in here. Linda, like you said, I appreciated the way the authors really acknowledged the difficulty of how hard it is to meet the needs of a group of 25 to 30 kids in a classroom who are all in different modes, right? So what do you do for one lesson when you're trying to teach for kids all over the map?
One of the things that I appreciated is the way that families were positioned as additional support people, and the way that strategies that they presented were really very organic. I think a big reason why that connected with me is I've got a senior in high school right now who definitely moves along that the quadrant at any given day or moment. Like, as his parent, I panic from time to time when I see him move out of that like explorer mode, and he doesn't necessarily respond to school the same way that I had originally hoped for. But one of the things that this particular framework gave me was permission to understand that what I see at him at school, which is a lot of passenger mode, but when he comes home and he is engaged in his real passion, which is tech related, he is very much in explorer mode. Like, this is like genuine curiosity. And a while ago, his dad and I sort of made the decision intentionally that we were going to support him in that curiosity around what was interesting to him. But I'm an educator. Always a voice in the back of my head saying, is this too much screen time? Am I pushing hard enough on the academic? Like, where do I draw the line? And what this really helped me to see was that what we were doing inadvertently was really encouraging that curiosity, and that building the relationship so that he hears loud and clear that we support him. I don't get it. I don't understand anything that he does on a given evening. Like, he'll tell me all about it, and I've gotten really good at smiling and repeating the last 3 words of his sentence to make it sound like a question. And I do my best, but that's like to try to maintain that relationship. And that's what I felt like was at the core of the family piece. And I feel like that's something that, Linda, as you mentioned, like, what do we do at a school level? Well, in part, I think we empower parents to understand that there's no right or wrong path for your kids to be on. And that really, like, bringing parents into the fold to say, you don't need to do all of these expensive intervention things. You don't need a lot of the suggestions right now that I think a lot of parents are leaning towards, but instead you need to spend the time getting to know your kid and getting to know what makes them curious and gets them excited. My final thought on this is you're right. When you've got 30 kids in the class, you can't manage all of that, but you can absolutely design lessons that are high engagement and high agency. Like, that is, I mean, at the core, that's really what we're talking about, is like, when kids are engaged with something that is interesting to them, we see the behavior increase, we see the curiosity increase, and we see their achievement increase.
There was a quote, and I ran it by one of my colleagues earlier. She didn't love this quote, but I kind of like it, which is, interests are to adolescents what chew toys are to puppies. And she didn't like the comparison of kids to dogs. However, the interest side is the thing that was pressed onto my psyche from this book, was really the importance of helping your kids find interests. And then I was just listening to the radio the other day, and there was a student who won they put out on NPR a call for proposals for little mini podcasts that were student made. And this young girl interviewed her grandmother about fry bread. And it was so incredible. And I could see how that personal interest became a situational interest, where she really dug in and made something that she could be really proud of, that showed who she was in the world. What an amazing assignment to be able to do something like that.
Yeah. And at the core of that, Sarah, just like to support what Linda was saying as well, like, at the core of how these decisions get made at the classroom level is policy and systemic leadership. So one thing that I hear in the Boston area, I'm on the school board, and we are very busy trying to decide how we are going to measure competencies for graduation. We recently had a law change that no longer is one of our requirements can no longer be the standardized tests that the state of Massachusetts gives. So with that, there's a lot of conversation about, so then what is our measurement, our indicators of graduation uh, competencies? And I'm sitting here thinking now, what I hear from the board, what I hear from parents, what I hear from teachers is everybody wants something that is more is more aligned with the high interest, right, and high engagement. And if we can, at a systemic level, create spaces where that's what's encouraged, I think then we can give teachers permission to get more creative or to feel like they have more flexibility in creating some different learning opportunities or some different ways for students to demonstrate mastery. I'm thinking, portfolios or project-based work, the things that we hear from some of those other schools. I think we could do.
Well, I mean, I think I could just bounce around all over the place. We use the panorama survey here to just see how we're doing, right? And there's a whole slew of questions on engagement. And so, like, as a staff, we have talked about how do we increase student engagement. Some of our percentiles seem low, but compared to the national average, they're right around there. But it's questions like, how often do you talk about what you're learning outside of school? How interested are you in what you're learning in class? And so there are some metrics for engagement that schools are measuring and trying to improve upon. And Sarah, you worked with our district where we have aim 1 and aim 2, and one is very academic focused and one is very much on belonging and trying to increase the sense of belonging. And I was just working with a young lady today who really, it would be hard to say what mode she's in. She's kind of got a lot going on, but really basically she's struggling with feeling a sense of belonging. And she's, of course, some rough stuff happening in her world. It's, makes me think also of like how we're having to make sure, like, are we meeting their basic needs first before we're trying to teach them how to graph a line? Are these kids hungry? Are they tired? Is there trauma in the home? There's so many different pieces to take into account that it does at times feel a little overwhelming. Or maybe we could flip that and say how urgent the work is. To make sure that we're making a difference sooner rather than later. Because these kids, it's like, this is their chance through K through 12. Like, this is our chance. And then a different line, because my brain works this way sometimes. I just recently went to the Colorado Science Conference, and I was in a session about quantum computing and how that's coming along, and how these kids that we're teaching right now are going to be the kids who are working in that workforce. If you're not a physics teacher or a physics PhD, it might be hard to prepare kids for this, but it's not the content they need. It's the skills. It's the perseverance. It's figuring out all that screen time that your son might be spending might be making him a perfect candidate down the road for working in these really interesting spaces. And so sometimes we're preparing kids for futures that we don't quite understand because they are evolving very quickly. I just think I have 2 boys, are twins. They're very, very different, but there's always that comparison because they're side by side. And one of them is constantly interested in new things, right? He learned how to crochet. He's learned how to bake sourdough bread. He just goes down all these different tunnels. And for me as a parent, it actually made me feel like, oh, he is an explorer often at home, not always at school, but he's often an explorer. And it made me actually feel good that he does that. His brother is very single-minded in what's interesting to him. He doesn't bounce around as like, this is the thing I love and I'm super into it. And so I think even just sharing that with parents, like, how do you give your kids opportunities to be in explorer mode? Because sometimes in school, it's harder to be in explorer mode. But at home, can we make spaces for them to be explorers in positive, healthy ways?
So you've seen the visual, but what brings the framework to life is how clearly these modes show up in schools and homes, and you've given us a couple of great examples. I want to take them one at a time so listeners can kind of hear the nuances. So let's start with passenger mode, which, if you recall, is this low engagement, low agency mode that kids are in. And one thing you said, Linda, is that kids have a lot going on. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they haven't eaten. So of course, passenger mode can be protective. And it says that in the book. Like, I can get through the day by looking like I'm doing what I'm supposed to, but there's a lot going on under the surface, right? So I just wanted to ask the group, did the author's framing add any new clarity or nuance for you about this mode? And if you remember one supportive move adults can make when they notice a young person slipping into this passenger mode as their default. Linda, let's start with you.
I think one of the things that feels overwhelming at times, but I'm not sure that it is, and Kyle, coming back to you, is like, how do we empower teachers without overwhelming them, right? How do we feel like, because choice, like giving kids some choice over either the task at hand or how they attack the task. I think giving kids choice is one way that we can move kids from passenger mode closer to explorer mode. And I think even when I was talking about the panorama survey, there's questions in here in terms of like how often do you get to choose what you're working on. I think coming up with ways to support teachers where they still feel like they are able to manage a classroom and have strong structures where kids feel safe and able to take risks, and also allow them some choice. And they don't have to be the big choices. We may not say, do you want to go to science today? But once they're in science, how do you give them choice to move them out of passenger mode?
It's a muscle that they have to build. And there was an example in the book, I think, where you can offer kids voice and choice and just hear crickets, right?
I kept thinking about how often I visit classrooms where I see that the majority of students appear to be in passenger mode. And the anecdote that you were sharing, like about do students even have an answer when we give them some of those choice? I mean, that's quite disturbing to me. One of the examples that I think that they used in the book was a girl who was just staring at a book with no intentions of reading anything, didn't change the page, nothing, and realized that no one noticed. I think about that as more often than not what we see, and that makes me really, really sad. When I think about how we get kids out of passenger mode, one of the things that we talked about is creating that psychological safety to try something new, to go in and to put yourself out there. But I see again and again, and this is not about just teachers. In fact, I'll back out of teachers now because I said this book resonated with me professionally and personally. On the personal side, so many of my fellow parents are carrying so much more water, so much of the weight of learning and decision making that is allowing kids to stay in passenger mode at home as well as at school. And so I think kids are, I mean, in some ways, kids are like, if your kid can handle some boredom and isn't going to cause like jump into a resistor mode and cause problems, then your like kid is perfectly happy to just sit and let the world like do what they need to do. And it's kind of like almost entertaining to watch the adults bend over backwards and do the mental gymnastics we do to make sure that everything is taken care of, running in front of our kids and like clearing the space so that there's not a challenge. But I loved what you said. I just want to double down, Sarah, on like, this is a muscle that is built. We have to start, honestly, even as early as when kids are toddlers, like giving that choice and giving some agency. And that's a huge shift in our thinking.
I want to talk about achiever mode next because I would say probably I gave birth to one. I guess they're both achievers. This is high engagement, low agency. So the danger in this part of the book is that they're praised because they do all the right stuff. They show up, they go to class, they turn in their homework, they read the book, they do the assignment, they join the group. But there are some important risks and limitations for these kids when they're left to their own devices because they did all the things that we laid out for them when we were carrying the water, to use your metaphor, Kyle. And they didn't get the muscle that helped them decide. So what resonated with you about their description of achievers, and where do you see achiever mode showing up in your schools or your work? What can we do to help them move to more purpose?
I'll go first because this was the section that I think I found the most eye-opening, maybe just gave me some language to some of the things that I have seen in so many different places. I, like you, Sarah, I definitely also gave birth to an achiever. I'm just gonna be really blunt. Like as part of the middle-class white Americans raising children, I see so many parents that are pushing really hard to get their child thinking that achiever mode is the goal. And one thing that they talked about in the book again and again that really resonated with me was how often we are really taking away kids' agency by signing them up into what is this early version of professional sports where kids are choosing a sport at a very young age, but they're getting pigeonholed into one sport that becomes very expensive and very all-encompassing, right? And And you start as an achiever. I'm watching, I have a sophomore in college as well. And she's the one that is very much in the achiever mode of having gotten the accolades from everyone around, every adult around her for so long. That became her identity, right? Is just like, I know that if I just do enough hard work, the adults around me will clap and I will feel better about myself. And so now watching her, she made the decision to go to college very far away. And so when she did that, she was left to really kind of redefine her own accolades. And luckily, she's very resilient and she's figuring it out, but not without some real growing pains. So I really appreciated this achiever mode because I just feel like maybe it was a little bit of a release of pressure on me, who a part of that sort of race to get everyone into all of these indicators of perfection of you've got this amazing athlete, you've got this amazing student, you've got this amazing, she's in the theater, like doing all these things. And at some point, this book really outlines the risk of that by taking away a student's agency and really like just redefining the goal of curiosity and exploring.
I think for many people, achiever mode seems like what we want for our kids, right? If you read the whole book, you realize it's not. But you start listening to achiever mode, and you're like, that sounds great. This kid's getting good grades, and they're doing all the honors classes, and they're doing community service, like all the things. And yet, as a school leader or as a teacher, I'm sure many of us have seen the kids who are in achiever mode, and then things start breaking down, and then we have some really serious mental health concerns. And it suddenly feels very scary. And I think, the vignette of the young lady who went to Yale, I believe, and was the absolute highest achiever and went to college and kind of the world fell apart. She almost failed out of school. She ends up doing a degree she's not even sure she's interested in, but that's where they had space for her. And, we have lots of conversations, it feels like these days, about higher education and if that's what every kid should do and should everyone have the ability and is it worth the money and the time and the stress. There's so many different pieces that really this achiever mode resonated for me as well, because my little bread baker, who can be an explorer, is also an achiever, and I do sometimes get concerned for him when he's really worried about acing a test more than learning what's on the test. And it's interesting for me as a mom, and we can't help but see these things through our own experiences. I had a mother who was a very busy single mom, and she was raising 3 kids, and I think the pressure on me was very low. And so like I did very well, and I wasn't necessarily an achiever. But now in hindsight, I was like, man, I could have done more, right? I wish she had pushed me a little bit. And so, of course, my sometimes thought is like, oh, I need to make sure that they're giving themselves all these opportunities. But reading that section really made me stop and think like, hang on, I care about my kids' health, physical, mental, emotional more than anything. And so is what I am doing moving them more into explorer mode, or am I setting them up for the trap of achiever mode? And that's really, as a parent, made me just pause. I just think of so many kids who, like you said, it's not always the family who's asking kids to become achievers. Some kids are kind of wired that way. They want the praise. They want to feel good. That's how they identify themselves. I'm smart, right? Or the young man who was in the gifted intelligent program and then for whatever reason didn't make it into the middle school version of that, and how that really shook his world. And the authors even posed the question, or I think the young man did, was like, well, how do we even make these labels, and what does it do for kids, and what does it mean when suddenly I always thought I was a smart kid and now I'm struggling in a class? We know that to build the ability to handle hard things, it's like sometimes we have to experience hard things. So we want to be careful with our kids, right? Like that also what you said, Kyle, is like, we don't want them to suffer. We want them to have all the things we didn't have. We want them to have a smooth path. But sometimes those bumps in the road is where they really are building a different set of skills that make them resilient and capable to handle whatever the world's going to bring at them. And so, yeah, achiever mode was very interesting to me, because I think if you start the chapter, you're like, well, this is what we want. And then you kind of keep reading and you're like, oh man, there's kind of this fragility here. And you could get someone going down the wrong path and then really struggling and needing a lot of potentially like mental health care. How do we make sure that it's giving them agency? And what does that mean?
So resistor mode is high agency, really, against learning. Like, I am not going to do that. And the authors make a strong case that this is often misunderstood. So I actually love resistors. I taught at a 12 school that was made up of entirely of resistors, I would say. And they got referred there because they didn't do well in a really traditional school. So these kids, it's less about defiance and more about protection. They're protecting themselves, but they don't know how to do it. They don't have like the right words or the right skills, as I understood the chapter. So how did this framing land with you? And, what's the ways that we as compassionate adults respond to our resistors?
All right, I'll hop in here first. I just recently made the transition from the classroom into my role as an administrator, and I miss my classroom all the time, for lots of different reasons. But I would say I often work with resistors who have been sent out of a classroom or are not thriving for whatever reason. Sarah, what you say really resonates with me. Like, for me, I actually think that they're kind of like trying to hide behind that action, right? I don't want you to realize I have no idea what's happening here. I don't necessarily want my peers to realize I can't read very well. I don't want to admit that I need a calculator to do these times table that everybody else is shouting out. When they get here, they're too young to drop out. They're staying in school. There's a law that says their parents are going to be in trouble if they don't come. So don't have somewhere else to go, so they come. And then they're like, but I can't engage with the work. Either I can't or won't. I just think so often it's like a lot of times we're not engaging them in the problem solving process. The adults sit around and talk, hey, so-and-so is not getting this done. And they have all kinds of theories, but what's often missing is the kid's voice in that. And so what's interesting is like having agency is in general a good thing. And so I'm sure we've all heard a quote, something along the line is like, I'm raising this stubborn child and this will bode well for her future, but right now it's really painful. I think there's this like, okay, so they're understanding, they're able to like, I can make this teacher, I know how to push these buttons. I can get this, I know how to make this kid react. So there is that piece of that is like a good skill, but it's often in a classroom setting seen as not good, right? Or even in terms of chronic absenteeism, I think of how many kids have just flat out told their parents like, no, I'm not going today. And literally I've seen parents pulling kids out of cars, like physically. And in my head, I'm like, your kid's just going to keep getting bigger. Like at some point you will not be able to manhandle them out of a car when a kid is like kind of figured out, my parents actually can't make me leave the house. Well, there's a part of me that wants to like celebrate that they have figured out that they have power, but they're the in-between stage of where that resistor mode is causing a lot of strife in homes or in classrooms is really concerning. And again, can we use the lens that kids need a different set of skills? And then, of course, what can we do while they're growing skills to engage them?
And this is what I'm hoping is sort of maybe this book is an indicator of a shift in our mindset around our students. Because I think that historically, the question when school isn't working for a child who's demonstrating that they are in resistor mode, the perception has been, oh, this kid is lazy, this kid is bad, this kid is causing problems. Whereas this, I think, particular book gives us a chance to rethink that and ask the question, what mode are we seeing right here? What are we seeing from this child that is telling us that something isn't working? And so I'm hopeful that this is like maybe an indicator that we're getting away from some of the achiever mode that you're describing, Sarah, and getting back to recognizing that students are individuals with individual needs. And more often than not, because Linda, I've had the exact same feeling so often, the kids that ended up in my office would be labeled by a very frustrated, understandably frustrated teacher. But in reality, what needed to happen is somebody needed to sit down and create a plan that includes the kids to bring them back into their learning in a way that's going to allow them to feel successful. And I really appreciated some of the strategies and just the one is that parents can even just re-encourage their resistor kid to get back into the classroom by like your algebra example, right? Instead of allowing a kid to go down the path of algebra is stupid and I'm never going to use this, and modeling instead how their understanding of how they learn is in fact what's going to be the biggest indicator of their success in the future. And it's not doing math in general is in fact something that is going to help them throughout their lives. Maybe that particular theorem or whatever you learn in algebra is not going to be the exact thing, but that notion of like I am a learner. I know how to learn and I know how to acquire new skills. That's the piece that they really encouraged parents to help reinforce at home.
Like what's your goal here? Is your goal here for them to do that algebra assignment? Or is your goal for your student to learn to do enough math that they can do the things they love, right? And so it always comes back to going to the kid and listening to what they want and really listening, which is so hard because as adults, we're like, oh, the world works a certain way. And the way your brain is working right now or doing the things is not going to serve you. But you can't live there. You have to live with what's going on for you, this non judgmental place, which I think can be hard to enter.
I think, for along that, Sarah, I think about how for me, I'm often wanting kids to just leave doors open. I don't care what door you go through, but don't close all the doors before you get there. When our systems sometimes move kids where they're no longer in school, right? Like we have systems of suspension and expulsion and those kind of things where like that's certainly not going to solve anyone's problem. And that really is changing the trajectory of that kid's life. You have some great concerns there. But Kyle, when you were talking earlier, I just felt like saying like, yes. And the resource that we often need to make those plans is like time and people with that expertise. And that is really hard to come by sometimes in a public education setting. We have a lot of people who care about kids and they want to do well by kids, but man, the resource of time and money and FTE and all those things that kind of come into play impact us all heavily. And so those kids who really need more, I have my little buddies, like I was just cleaning up my cups back here. The kids that come in, I say, drink some water, sit down, take some time, we'll talk. But those are the guys that need probably the biggest plan. And often it's hard to get those in place again in time to intervene so they don't close doors on their future.
We're going to finish up with explorer mode, which I felt like every story were kids who came from other modes and found themselves in explorer mode finally. I don't think there were very many stories of kids who just were in explorer mode. The authors hold this up as the goal. These are the kids that experience the most joy, curiosity, and self-directed learning. So what felt especially true or powerful when you were reading about explorers?
I shared the vision of what good learning and what good learning looks like in this notion of curiosity. And I really appreciated the definition being an explorer is someone who I can see that kid who lights up even when they're in resistor mode in one person's class and then they're going into their, I don't know, robotics class and they have the opportunity to try and demonstrate their learning a different way or their engagement is higher and they just get curious and they get excited. And what that came down to in the book that really spoke to me the most was this idea. It was all about choice and relevance and psychological safety, right? That's what puts kids into the explorer mode. And those are the three things that I think that we as educators are always pushing for, and having it broken down that simply was really helpful.
That choice,
And
relevance,
psychological safety.
and psychological safety.
I think what's interesting is kids rarely will know what's going to be that thing that's like, man, I love this. There's so many different ways that kids became explorers in this book. And we've all seen kids who, I mean, even for myself, right? Like, I think if you told my high school teachers I became a physics teacher, many of them would have been surprised because I was like the kid with my nose in a book and I was like, I don't like science. I don't like math. Like I can do it, but it's not my thing. And so like it was later in my world when I figured out that brought me joy and that I enjoyed it. And I think of how my friend's kiddo is just starting college. And I know like there was this moment of panic that she didn't know what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. And I thought, do you have to know right when you go to college? I thought you were supposed to go and figure it out. My best friend wanted to be an engineer since she was 5 and she is an engineer, loving life. I think it's just really interesting to think about accidental or serendipitous when people find out that thing that they enjoy. And so like, how do we have those opportunities and nurture them when a kid stumbles upon this thing that really interests them? And it doesn't always have to be something like flashy, like we talk a lot about like theater for certain kids or robotics for kids. It's like there's so many different things, but the truth of that is we don't know what it's going to be. And how do we still encourage students to do well in these other areas where maybe they're more of a passenger so that they can continue to move forward and embrace their explorerness.
As a parent, since this book was written to parents, I have this daughter of mine who says to me, trust, full stop, period, trust. And I actually have to stop in my tracks and go, oh, you want me to trust you to do this thing and you want me to back the heck off and let you do it. And I think honestly, that's one of the big takeaways from this book. I am going to field some questions, and we have a question from Annabelle, who's calling us from New Mexico. Hi, Annabelle. She says, I'm curious if the book explores, pun intended, the impact of the structure of schools, like grades, punishment, reward systems on kids achieving Explorer mode. Does that potentially make Explorer mode more difficult to achieve?
I think maybe they didn't go quite as far as making that direct connection. What they did talk about though was that a lot of those structures contribute to our students getting stuck in that unhappy achiever mode. One thing that they were very explicit about though is some of these ways that we give accolades of I don't know, Skittles and rainbow stickers, I think were some of the examples that they mentioned, does not do anything to move kids into explorer mode. I would argue, and I don't know, I'd be curious what Sarah and Linda think, but I would argue that it's probably pretty difficult to get a kid out of explorer mode unless you take away one of those things, one of those pieces that I talked about choice, psychological safety, and relevance. Like if you took those things
Relevance.
away, yes, I think that we could move a kid out of explorer mode. But in terms of some of the incentives, it's an interesting question. But yes, definitely made the argument that we're not going to get kids to explorer mode by bribing them with treats.
I think about like taking away explorer mode. I think once you have explorer mode and you have agency, I can see kids pretty much lawyering up to fight you so that they could have those things indefinitely.
But wouldn't that be great too? I mean, that's an example, right? Like I don't like, I actually would be thrilled to see a kid like not lawyering up technically, but I'll tell you one day, like my daughter noticed that only the boys had access to the soccer field we were not living in the United States, and the boys would go to the soccer field, the football field, and the girls were never having a chance. And so she literally started a petition and walked around because she had gone to a teacher and said, when can the girls have it? And the teacher said, well, girls don't want it. And she said, I think the girls want it. And he said, you bring me a petition with 50 signatures and then we'll talk about it. And she did it. So like a perfect example, right? Of like, I'm going to fight for my rights. Like that is an example, I think, of explorer mode, and passion, right? That goes a lot longer than we think.
I love that story. Like, what a great thing for adolescents because they're building this identity. And you've just told me that I can't have that identity, and I'll
100%.
show you.
You don't
Right.
you don't mess with Estella. That is just the bottom line.
Here is another question. So, how do we support teachers who feel stuck in their own version of resistor mode? They're overwhelmed, they're burned out, or unsure of how to reach disengaged students. Linda, I think you probably would have a lot to say about this. What can we offer as thoughts or strategies to this person?
I mean, when you were talking earlier, Sarah, it really resonated with me that like these are not just kids. Like we're talking about the disengaged teen, but we could easily put many adults in this continuum as well. But in the classroom as a teacher leader, I think this is really challenging for me because like with kids, I feel like, all right, this is our job is to, get you through. And it is really tough when you work with a teacher who is possibly in resistor mode. And it could be for so many reasons, right? I think about you. Like here's the curriculum and you got to get this done and you need to have a common assessment with your teammates and like there's so many amazing things that can happen, but we talk a lot about collaboration and I think Jenny Donahue a million years ago, I feel like I read a book from her where she was talking about we assume that teachers are good collaborators, but it is also a skill. And so if you don't have a strong team, or you feel isolated from your team, or you don't feel a sense of belonging or engagement, right? Like all these things that we've just talked about for students is also true of teachers. How do we make sure that teachers have some choice and voice and are yet meeting the commitments? I often tell teachers, you don't have to give kids the same experience, but when those kids go home at the end of the day, you want them to have had some shared moments of wonder and awe in a classroom so that they're more likely to be engaged.
Was it in this Resistor chapter where they talked about this belonging uncertainty? This concept where when kids feel like they're unsure if they belong, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I wonder too, what you're saying, Linda, is like sometimes this can feel true for teachers. Like I have belonging uncertainty. I'm not sure
100%.
if I do this, if I'll belong, or if I do this, and maybe I want to map. Maybe I want to map to show what are the skills here that would really help me do the work in a way that feels like I'm part of something bigger than
I'm
myself.
really reminded as you say that, I just want to like name what I think the difference, the question of how do we support teachers who are in that resistor mode, I don't think is any different, right? It's relevance and psychological safety and choice. And I think that, and I'm naming that because I really think a lot of this comes down to the action of the administration and of the school committee and policymakers that have influence over what is making it down into our classroom level. So if we have a situation where I don't know any teacher who ever got into the field to intentionally make any child's life miserable. Quite the opposite. Like, right, these are humans that care deeply for the smaller humans that they're educating. And I think that so often what we need to do, I'm thinking about, even like I said, at the school board level, like, do we need to really step back and ask ourselves what it is that we value as a school district that we're going to task the superintendent with to create a culture that is based on choice, relevance, and psychological safety? And how do we build that from the top to the bottom? That's what I feel like is the most important thing. And that's how we support teachers that are stuck in that same feeling, because it doesn't feel good.
All right. So one thing that you'll carry forward into your practice and how people can find you in the world.
I was already telling you before we got started, I have mentioned it a lot to colleagues and parents. I think just uh, giving yourself some time and space to think of these modes and that it's not like an identity. I would just encourage parents to like learn what this framework is and kind of understand what these different modes are. And because I think as soon as you get the framework, you will see your kid moving in and out of these things throughout their days and their lives. So understanding it's not permanent, I don't think it's like you can't be an explorer all the time. It's like, okay, there might be a time and a place for this, but there are ways to move. I do love that the book has some strategies. Like that it's not just here's all the problems, I have no solution. So where you can find me is often on lunch duty. If anyone wants to join me outside, I do have a LinkedIn account, and I'm kind of out there mostly. Just here in Grand Junction, or I live in Fruta. Doing what I can in
Doing
the
the good
current setting
work,
I find
doing
myself.
the very good work with those middle schoolers. I love middle schoolers. They're so full of all the things, hope, optimism, squirreliness. So
Yes,
thanks for all you do, Linda.
thank you for that opportunity.
I'm going to be taking with me this framework. I think is going to be my sort of new mode of thinking. If I'm being honest, I really love this on the personal and professional level. I've talked about my personal kids. On a professional level, I'm the founder of an organization, a co-founder of an organization called Building Leaders, and we provide spaces for school principals to come together in community and learn from one another, visiting each other's schools and building communities of practice. And so I'm thinking so much about how I can set those experiences up to intentionally create space for exploring and scratching the curiosity itch that our school principals and assistant principals, I should say, Linda, are so curious to have. So I'm taking that with me. And if people are interested in finding me, I do have my LinkedIn. And you can also always find me at our Building Leaders website, which is building-leaders.org.
It's a beautiful website that
I
Kyle
was an explorer
has
for a hot
created
minute on
there.
that one.
She was in explorer mode. I think my big takeaway is one of the things that's been the foundation of my work are these durable skills for school and beyond. I'm going to put below this in the recording a link to the durable skills for school and beyond. And it's 42 behaviors that kids in all these different modes are trying to grow and develop so that they can be prepared for the jobs, as Linda said so eloquently, that don't even exist yet. They are those portrait of a graduate skill sets and things. And you can see really clearly where some kids need certain things if they're in resistor mode, and some kids need things if they're in achiever mode, passenger mode, and even our explorers are building some of those skills. I'm still building some of those durable skills. So it's a great list if you want to take a look at it. Thank you both for being here. It's been such a gift to hear not just your perspectives on the book, but the ways your work connects to the book and your own commitments and communities that you serve. Thanks for joining us for this first book club, and I wish you all very, very, very great holidays ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. As we wrap up today's conversation, I want to invite you into what this book club is really meant to be. A shared space for educators, leaders, and parents who want to think more deeply about adolescence and how we support young people in this moment. This isn't a passive listening experience. Each book we read is chosen with the community, not for it. And I'd love for you to help us shape where we go next. If you head to the efficaciouseducator.com and click on Book Club in the menu, you'll be able to vote on the next book we read together, a conversation that will air here on the podcast in February. Whether you join as a listener, maybe a future panelist, or simply someone who wants a shared language for supporting young people, you are so welcome here. Thank you for spending your time with us, for the work you do with adolescents, and for being a part of a growing community. Happy holidays.